So hello, everyone. Welcome to the seminar series in Corruption and Impunity. This session is entitled Violence and Crime Risk, Shifting from Individual Targeting to Scenario Assessments and Strategic Player Targeting. This event is organized by the Center for Mexico and Central America at the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University in New York, and also by the Legal Research Institute at the National University of Mexico. The seminar stands out due to its international audience that consistently participates across all 11 sessions. Nevertheless, as a joint event with Columbia University, we extend our support to Columbia Studies students and faculty affected by the recent events, and we hope that the ongoing negotiations and debates will bring resolution and understanding during these critical times. The seminar series serves as a dynamic forum that brings together experts and professionals to explore complex social issues, particularly those contributing to the proliferation of corruption and impunity. Our goal has been to foster unconventional dialogues, to delve into innovative problem-solving methodologies. We convene data scientists, academics, and professionals in the legal and political realms to discuss and develop new approaches to these pressing challenges. In previous sessions, we delve into dynamics of complex relationships within criminal networks, discussing the need for adaptable legal and prosecutorial strategies to handle the multitude of offenders and offenses using data analysis from countries like Guatemala and Mexico, where overwhelmed judiciaries and prosecutor officers struggle to cope. This session will explore how data and analytics can improve crime risk assessment and inform policy decision-making by critically examining punitive strategies used to control criminal behavior. Police and prosecutors frequently deploy targeted and kingpin strategies to dismantle or control criminal networks. However, in many countries, this approach has resulted in the mass incarceration of offenders who continue their criminal activities from within prison, thereby strengthening their networks, or who receive minimal sentences that contribute to a revolving door effect. Veronica Subillaga will discuss cases from various Latin American countries, highlighting the frequent use of the mano dura or iron fist strategy, punitive strategy, as a part of electoral campaigns, and how prisons often become hubs for recruitment and career advancement for criminals. Bruno Ricao da Cunha will offer a different perspective by focusing on application of analytics. He will share insights from his professional experience and research in Brazil, demonstrating that targeting individuals alone is insufficient. His findings advocate for holistic solutions, showing that massive incarceration is an ineffective strategy for controlling criminal networks. Instead, comprehensive systemic approaches should be implemented to address the issue more effectively. So I'm really thrilled and grateful for both speakers that have accepted our invitation to participate in this seminar. For those of you who join us for the first time, welcome. We will begin with an initial round of interventions from our speakers, followed by a second round for elaboration of ideas and discussion. And we will also incorporate comments from Q&A section, so please do use the platform in the Q&A section. I will present both of our speakers today. Veronica Subillaga is professor at the Universidad Simón Bolívar in Venezuela. She's Tinker Researcher at the Institute for Latin American Studies at Columbia University here in New York. And her ethnographic work has become centered in gang violence in Caracas, gender, and public policy. And Bruno Ricao da Cunha is member of the TRM Global Investigations team, based in Rio Grande, a southern state in Brazil. And he is also a former member of the Brazilian Federal Police. His research in social physics and network sciences plays a crucial role in supporting the network of researchers associated within this seminar who are working on this approach. And we're very happy to have Bruno here. So with these words of introduction, I turn now the floor over to Veronica Subillaga. Welcome, Veronica. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Isa, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to share my work. I will start sharing my screen. So the idea of, after we had this conversation with Isa, the idea is to share some insights from my ethnographic work, mainly in Caracas, in Venezuela, to think about and to reflect upon the impact of mass incarceration policies. And also I will make some associations with what is happening in other countries of Latin America, such as especially El Salvador, but also Brazil. So I will start saying that nowadays it's very popular to hear about the Bukele model. Noboa is also systematically talking about the militarization of security. So this is a hot and a very important topic nowadays, and I'm glad we are having this conversation in order to reflect upon the impact of mano dura policies. So I will share with you my research showing the impact of mano dura policies within the police agents, but also in terms of how these kind of policies contributes to the organization of the criminal gangs. And we can say that mano dura policies and contribute in an important manner to the organization of the criminal organizations. And we can see a sort of a similar path if we see the PCC in Brazil, Comando Vermelho, in the 90s, but in Venezuela, what has happened with, before we had youth gangs, and now we have criminal organizations. You might have heard about El Tren de Aragua. My work has been focused in Caracas and the mutation of these gangs into a confederation of organized crime groups. So my talk will focus on two parts. First, documenting and understanding police brutality, from carceral punitivism to massive killing in Venezuela. And then something that is not very visible is the effect these policies have in women's daily lives in the communities where the organized crime groups are based. So these are the two main focuses of my conversation today. What I will present you is the result of long-term ethnographic work in Caracas. Mostly and lately, I have developed ethnographic work in two barrios or two popular neighborhoods. One is La Cota. This neighborhood has been affected by massive mano dura policies and police forces invasion. The other community that is called Catuche is near the presidential palace and has not been affected by these mano dura policies, and it has a long tradition of civic organization. So I want to compare the effect in women's daily lives between communities that have suffered mano dura policies and communities that have a long tradition of civic organization. And also we have, this is a work I have been developed, I have developed with Rebecca Hanson. And we have done lots of also interviews, not only with women, but journalists, members of the criminal organizations, and police agents as well. So what I am talking is published in two articles. This recent article, Shoutings, Scoldings, Gossip, and Whispers, has just been published in the Latin American Research Review in March this year. So documenting and understanding police brutality in Venezuela. So just to give you a brief concept, during the 90s, Venezuela's homicide rates were more similar to Mexico's or even Brazil. During the 90s, we had especially urban and armed violence associated with gangs that were engaged in drug micro-traffic. But afterwards, after the Bolivarian Revolution and some other factors that I will not delve in here, we have had homicide rates not like Brazil, not 20 homicides per 100,000 in homicides, but like in Salvador or Honduras. For instance, in 2016, our homicide rate was almost like in El Salvador. These are countries that have experienced wars not so long ago. Yeah, so now Venezuela has experienced more or less similar processes compared to El Salvador, where we have had strong mano dura policies and periods of negotiations and pacts between organized crime groups and the government. So how does the Chavez government respond to this increase of crime? So like in Ecuador nowadays, we had this strong militarization of public security in Venezuela. In my work with Rebecca Hanson, we proposed that we have had at least 2 waves of this militarization of public security in Venezuela. We have one first wave of massive incarceration that we have called carceral punitivism. And then after prisons were overcrowded and we had now the visibility of these criminal organizations, then another phase that we have called systematic state killings was developed, especially departing from 2015 with the operative of the liberation of the people, and the discourse of the government was that these communities were going to be liberated from organized crime. And then after all the denounces, we had the Fuerzas de Acción Especial de la Policía, more targeted police lethal violence directed toward criminal groups. So just to give you an idea, imagine from 2009 until 2011, prison population doubled. That meant that the government and the state lost the control of the prisons, and we started to have more organized prison gangs. And then we have this flow of information and men between prisons and their communities. And we started to have the visibility of organized crime groups. For instance, in the newspapers, it was common already to talk about what it was called the paths of death, to mean how in this area, in the southern periphery of Caracas, there were criminal organizations. I work here where the criminal organization of this leader, El Coqui, was based. So I will talk about these transformations. But after the visibility of the organization of these criminal organizations and related to the failure of this massive incarceration, then we have this other wave that we call massive killings. You can see, for instance, the masks of the police agents with the schools. I mean, all the symbols of what we have called in our work, following the work of Cameroonian philosopher Akil Pembe, necropolitics, right? So the discourse of officials were eradication, neutralization, I mean, all this war discourse. And indeed, police deaths perpetrated by police forces increased impressively. For instance, in 2015, we had 1,700 killings perpetrated by the security forces. But the year after, police killings increased, and then we had 4,600 killings perpetrated by the police. When we did interviews with police agents, for instance, this young man, to summarize what he says, he said, well, these guys started to get organized in prisons, and then all these leaders, those complicated guys, have to be eliminated. Then we started to eliminate, to cleanse especially the popular sectors. So you can grasp how this discourse of killings was also spread between police agents. Rebecca Hanson's also collected police stories where systematically there is this presence of what they call the green light to kill. So they told Rebecca that, well, here the order is to wipe out delinquents. We have a green light. The order is to go and wipe out. And so just to give you an idea, then in those years, for instance, 2016, all the violent deaths that year were at least 21,000. Well, that year, as I said, police forces were responsible of 4,667 killings. That means that the police forces were responsible of 21% of the violent deaths that year. Just to give you an idea, comparing what happened in Venezuela with Brazil in 2016, that was this year that where police forces were particularly violent. That year in Brazil, that is a country that has at least 200 million inhabitants, the security forces in Brazil killed 4,219 persons. In Venezuela, a country that has 31 million inhabitants, police forces were responsible for 4,600 killings, just to give you the idea of the magnitude of police killings. So how do women experience this extreme police violence, and on the other hand, also the presence of armed actors in their communities? So I worked in these communities in Caracas. So these communities, we can say that we had a strong criminal governance of this confederation of organized crime groups. And the other community was here in La Pastora, near from the presidential palace, where we had a strong history of civic organizations. So one community is Catuche, strong history of civic organizations and networks with the church, universities. In that community, women achieved to have a ceasefire pact with the gangs. In the other community was affected by the mano dura policies and extensive militarized invasions. This is a picture of the entrance of the community, just to give you an idea of the military and the symbolism of the police invasions. These are the women that belonged to the peace commissions in Catuche, where they got this ceasefire pact. We work a lot there with these women, and we produce this kind of books to think about the process and the key processes that were in the ceasefire pacts. The other community also, Lakota, where the military invasions occurred, is situated in a hill. So geographically, this criminal organization could have certain superiority in the sense that when police invasions came, they already were like in a lookout so they can respond and prepare. Yes, so how did women live in this situation? You can see here the traces of the bullets in people's, of the bullets of the police operatives in people's houses. This is the community. I work here in this community kitchen with the women, so I was present there and saying that I was documenting police violence and police killings. That was the justification that for me in order to be there and do observation and interviews, not only with the women, but with the criminal organizations. So the questions of our research is how women deal with this chronic violence, how do they deal with the mano dura policies and the criminal organizations in their neighborhoods. So after being there, one of the important observations in the field was this important presence of women, but not as women only, but as mothers. The presence of mothers was very important. Also, the impact of these various armed actors in their lives, and then the importance of daily conversations. I mean, and in that sense, women were important agents of information circulation and the definition of the men's reputations. So they can assign categories to these men, and these categories they have real effect in their reputations. For instance, see, one young man is classified as a threat to the community because he steals neighbors. Well, this young man probably would be killed by the leader of the criminal organization, or he will be denounced to the police. So this is to say that women were agents of information circulation and assigning categories that affected these men's reputations. So what we have when we compared the experience of women in these two communities is that in the communities where we have this long tradition of civic organizations and presence of other organizations, church and university, women were able to conform peace commissions. And they were, and also what was very evident to us was the importance of the discursive strategies. They talked a lot about how they could talk with these men in order to abide to the ceasefire pact. And in the other community, we will see women were so afraid that they could barely whisper. That is what I will focus in the minutes I have. So in the Catuche community, women used strategically their role as mothers, and they scolded the men as if they were my children. So the use of the position of the mother was very important and strategically used to relate with these young men in order to continue the ceasefire pact. Also, talking was, and it was interesting to think about Charles Steele's contentious conversation in the sense that how this everyday talking was important to set the rules and transform everyday routines in that community, in the sense that as a result of the ceasefire pact, these men could not be with their guns openly in the community. In the other community where the mano dura policies were massive, that produced also that the criminal organization was in, I will say, in a state of alert all the time, like in a war mode. So in that community, for instance, they killed and burned a woman that was suspicious of talking and giving information to police forces. So you can imagine that this was a spectacular punishment to show the community and to show women the consequences of talking too much. So this story of the woman bird was persistently present where we spoke when we spoke with the women. So in that community, women were whispering all the time. They didn't even dare to pronounce the name of the men of the criminal organizations because they were afraid of being taken as if they were going to talk and denounce them in the police. So, and also an important thing was the role of gossip. If in Catuche, women could threaten the men saying that they were going to talk about them, that they were going to talk shit about you in order to affect their reputation and maybe denounce them. So the efficacy of gossip is this fact of circulating information from the private domain to the public domain and then have real consequences. In the other community, women were so afraid that they didn't dare to talk. So in our work we talk about gossip in captivity. And that means that women's discursive strategies loses all their efficacy in the sense that they cannot talk. So women, we had these kind of expressions like women say, well, we live here like little animals in the jungle, like the little monkey. I can see, I can hear, I can speak. They fire their weapons and we cannot say, look, don't fire here. So for us, this kind of expressions had resonance with what Giorgio Agamben calls nuda vida, I mean, the naked lives. That means living without any kind of rights, living in a situation of a state of exception. And we could feel the fear in women's life. So just to wrap up and start to finish my talk, just again thinking about massive mano dura policies, where also you have this kind of symbolic dehumanization of these young men. I can say, thinking, if I think of El Salvador and this extreme dehumanization, this might be plausible to go from this massive carceration to massive killing. I mean, this is like a sort of a horrifying horizon, but it might be plausible to go through that step. These are also women in El Salvador. These women are outside the prisons too. So this is comparable to the experience of women in Venezuela when we had this extensive, massive incarceration. So ethnography can show you too this different pattern of victimization. Kristen Smith's work also shows how in Brazil, what she calls the sequelae, the Latin name of after effect consequences and impact of mano dura policies in the mothers of these young men. These mothers live a sort of social death and a very slow weakening and getting sick of nervous breakdown. So this kind of difference this kind of different patterns of victimization ethnography can show. For instance, also in El Salvador, they are starting to denounce the impact of massive incarceration in women's life. In Venezuela too, our work, we were able to share our work with the independent international fact-finding mission of the Bolivarian Revolution of the United Nations in Venezuela. So that means that the Maduro government is right now under investigation of the International Criminal Court, and ethnography and other NGOs documenting of cases was important to visibilize internationally these massive killings. And I will end saying that we are working now with also the search for justice. We are working with women helping and promoting victims organizations for the search of justice in Venezuela. And again, ethnography is a very important tool to document these kind of human rights abuses, but also to help to promote politicization of the women's victims. And I will leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Veronica, so much for your intervention. I think your talk clears the way very, very effectively in how this type of policies have a deep impact in societies, but particularly in women, and also dehumanizing the incarcerated men, right? So so there should be another way. There should be different strategies and should be different ways to do this. And in your research, and your colleague, you propose something that is more nuanced and it's oriented to the civil participation and organizations and the collaboration of society as a network of social support. Well, thank you so much again, and I turn now the floor to Bruno. Thank you, Bruno, for joining us, and it's all yours.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to share my screen, so if you bear with me for a moment. Share. All right, so you probably can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so yeah, I was already introduced, but my name is Bruno Requião. I'm currently a global investigator at TRM Labs, and I was a Brazilian federal police agent for more than a decade. And besides that, I was a postdoc in applied maths in the University of Limerick, and I have a PhD in physics, and I authored this book called Criminal Physics, The Science of Criminal Interactions, which is something that I will talk briefly with you all during this talk. All right, so my idea here is to get you all out of your comfort zone, to help you think out of the box, to question what is data science, what is crime, what is science, and to bring all these concepts together in what I like to call criminal physics, or criminal physics, if you will, which actually drinks from the same source of social physics. That is something that you guys may have already heard about. The idea is that crime is a complex phenomenon, right? All of us knows that. And complex here is a technical term. This is something that I like to stress. Something complex in the sense of a physical quantity, something that the sum of its parts is not exactly the entire entity, right? So if you sum the parts and you check it with the thing that you're actually analyzing, it's completely different. That in a loose sense, that is what complex means in a technical term. And we do see that there are a lot of mathematical regularities in every human collective behavior. And that has been observed since the beginning of the 20th century by Nicholas Calder and other mathematicians and sociologists. And that, summing all that up, the sociological literature supports network science as a tool to understand society, and in a more precise view, crime. So this is not actually something new. Since David Hume in the 1800s, in the 1700s, sorry, thinkers, philosophers, scientists believe that society should be studied by the same lenses as the physical sciences, by the same epistemology, if you will. And that kept on going until we got to Quetelet in the 1800s, and then Auguste Comte in a little bit later. And the funny thing that some people like to say that Quetelet created this term social physics to describe the epistemology of natural sciences applied to society. And Comte was actually thinking something similar, but he needed a new term to be the first one to bring up a new idea. And to do that, he couldn't use social physics, so he invented a new word at the time, which is sociology. So sociology, in its origin, has the same epistemology as natural science, even though we don't usually do that a lot nowadays. It's something that we should be aware of. And there are a lot of examples that physics, mathematics, and natural sciences could be used to change how we look at society, from cellular automata trying to explain social aggregation. Magnetism can be used to understand opinion dynamics, and so forth. And what we will talk a bit more during this talk is that graph theory, or network science, if you will, can be used to understand criminal networks. And how can we support this idea of applying network science, applying physics to understand criminal activities and society as a whole? We can understand that by checking, for instance, the social facilitation model proposed by Robert Zajonc in the 70s. The idea is that we tend to perform better when we are exposed to an audience, we are exposed to a network, to a group of individuals that is observing us. And this actually, it doesn't only happen with humans, it happens to a lot of different animals. And it brings us to the idea that some of our behaviors are not actually thought about. We tend to act instinctively, in instinct, if you will. It's easier to say that. And all these behaviors that are instinct, in a way, they shape how we interact in networks, how we interact in groups, in collectives, and that happens as well with criminals. All the enact behaviors that everyone has, that criminals have, they shape how the networks that they are in operate, how they behave. So some examples here: the Twin Towers attack. We have a very clear network here. Each node here is a terrorist, and interaction between terrorists depends on where they were based at and which of the flights they were involved with. Again, the Operation Red Dawn by the U.S. Army to get Saddam Hussein. It is widely known that network science tools were used to reach him. Details, for obvious reasons, are not disclosed. A Brazilian example, the car wash operation, which ended up in the arrest of the current president into 2016. As far as we know, the police didn't actually use network science during this investigation, but it is an interesting example of a large criminal network. And why is this important? It's because of how networks operate, regardless if we're dealing with human beings or computers or animals or whatever you will. This is actually the most powerful feature of network science, is that we can use it to understand different phenomena, from society to the stars, if you will. And the thing here is that if humans interact randomly, and we start to arrest people randomly as well, reactively arresting individuals, in theory taking them off of the larger social network, there will be a threshold of removals at which the network will collapse as a whole. This is what we are seeing. You guys can see my mouse here
Yes,
moving
we can.
around, right? Okay, so this is what we are seeing here, right? We start removing randomly parts of the network, or in a criminal sense, the state start to arrest people randomly. And if the connections, the criminal connections are actually random, there will be a threshold at which the network atomizes completely, and we don't have an actual network of criminals interacting. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Most real networks, especially social networks and mostly criminal networks, they don't operate randomly. People connect with a given, let's say, general law. People tend to interact precisely with other individuals for a lot of different reasons, but it's not randomly. And because it's not random, if we start like arresting individuals randomly from a not random network, we will have to arrest everyone from that network, so it get actually totally atomized, right? But the good news is that if we change the focus here and we start removing individuals that have a prominent role in structuring these networks, we can again recover this behavior. And if we remove a small fraction of individuals from this network, the network will collapse entirely without the need of arresting everyone from this criminal network. However, this is not so easy to do in practical terms, because it's not intuitive in general to know who are the individuals that have a more prominent role in structuring this network. And I like to show that by checking this graph here. You can think of it as a criminal network. Let's say a small investigation. Each individual here, let's say, is a criminal involved in, I don't know, an illicit drug trafficking operation, for instance, right? And what I like to do is ask you guys if you think the blue one, or if you think that the red one is the most important individual in this network. Okay, so think about it for a second. If you think the red one is more important, or if you think the blue one is more important. And let's change a bit the view of this network to this. This is the same network. We're just seeing it differently. When we do that, we can see that if we remove, let's say, criminal 2, criminal blue, the network still remains practically intact. We just removed one individual from the large component of the network. But if we remove the red individual here, the network is split into 3 smaller parts. Okay, so this is to show you guys that not always the hub or the more connected and the most connected individual is the most important one in structuring criminal networks. Okay, and we're just here we're just dealing with a very small criminal network, right? But let's say that we're dealing with these kinds of networks. Let's say that we are dealing with macro criminality, if you will, like the criminal network of a region, of a country, of a continent, or internationally, if you will. It's impossible to qualitatively pinpoint which are the most important individuals in this network. That's why we need data analytics to at least give police or prosecutors North Star to which they should point their investigations, right? And what does it mean again to be more important, right? It depends on what we are trying to understand. We're trying to understand someone that is popular in a network, which is someone that is highly connected, or we're trying to understand leadership, for instance, in a network. You can think of, let's say, um, Bin Laden, right? He wasn't probably a highly connected individual for a lot of obvious reasons, but there would be a ball, that's the technical term, a periphery of individuals, if you will, that would be highly connected to put into practice his orders. Right? And this is what we call collective influence. But let's say we're interested in understanding the amount of information that passes through each individual, and that will be between a centrality. For instance, between a centrality is interesting if we want to gather information about a criminal network, let's say PCC, as Veronica mentioned, and we want to monitor PCC. We don't need to monitor everyone. We need to monitor the individuals that have a high between a centrality, because all the information passes through this guy. So again, it depends. We have to be precise on what we actually want. We want to dismantle criminal network. We want to monitor it. What we want to do. And this brings us to the idea of weak ties that was proposed in the 70s, again, by this sociologist called Mark Granovetter. And the idea is that, and the idea is that humans tend to cluster into groups that are highly connected, and these clusters are sparsely connected to other similar clusters. And this is graphically what we are showing here. Let's say the red individuals here, they are, let's say, a gang. They operate together, they have strong ties, and there are some individuals that bridge this cluster here with the blue cluster. By its turn, all the blue criminals, the blue gang, if you will, have strong ties, and they operate together, and they have more trust between them, and so forth. So these weak ties that were proposed by Granovetter, they are actually very important in the way that they actually act as glue, as a social glue. They actually are the components that bring together different different clusters, and are responsible for actually making a larger, a macro criminal network to operate. And we checked that in a 2015 paper, and we checked Granovetter's idea, and we actually showed that, again, if we remove the weak ties between these groups, we can, by removing 3% criminals from a criminal network, we can totally dismantle it. But if we used, let's say, if we targeted hubs, the more connected individuals, the most popular individuals, we wouldn't be able to do that with a 3% removal. And the idea here is that how to understand that from the criminology perspective is that in graph theory or in network science, you can dismantle a network in two ways. You can remove an edge, or you can remove a node. An edge removal would be imprisonment, an ideal imprisonment, right? All of us know that mostly in South America, that once an individual gets arrested, he won't lose its connections. He's probably going to get a lot more connections, right? But here I'm just doing a proof of concept. It's the idea of an idealized imprisonment. And the node removal would be a perfect resocialization, that individual decides not to be part of any criminal network from there on, or that from confrontation to the police or between different gangs or wherever. So these two ideas are interesting, and it brings us to some basic concepts about criminal networks. The first one is about about network brightness, and the idea is that criminal networks, they tend to be less bright than a typical social network, because they tend to obfuscate their activities from the state, from the police, from prosecutors, and that is reflected in the network and how the density of connections decreases because of that. So criminal networks tend to have a lower graph density than I don't know, a social, a Facebook, let's say, graph, if you will, or your own academic connections and so forth, right? And usually we differentiate between organized crime and terrorism and pedophile rings, because when we're dealing with organized crime, criminals tend to decrease the graph density, to decrease the brightness of the network, but they can't decrease it that much because they need efficiency. They need to pass over orders, funds, wherever through the connections, right? So they have to balance. They have to be aware of this trade-off between secrecy and efficiency. But that doesn't usually happen in terrorism or pedophile rings, because they don't need to be that efficient as in organized crime, for example, right? And this brings us to the idea of compartmentalization and modularity. The weak ties that I just mentioned is what we call the modularity, right? So this clusterization of human behavior into modules is what we call, usually in police frameworks, as compartmentalization. And again, this is interesting because at the same time that it decreases the network density, it makes the network less bright because of the weak ties. Internally, inside the clusters, it increases the network efficiency. Again, what I wanted to guys to understand from this is that these are typical behaviors that we get from natural sciences that are happening in social sciences, in criminal networks, in everything. So this is the power of what I call criminal physics. I'm going to, I know that I'm being quite fast here. There are a lot of different concepts, but the idea is just for you guys to think out of the box, to kind of, so I'm going to show you two quick real life examples. This is the Brazilian Federal Crimes Network. We have almost 24,000 criminals involved in it. It was gathered in 2014, and this is showing a lot of different network science features. It is a small world. It has a heavy tail distribution. It's not random, as I said earlier. It's highly modular. So everything that we talked about earlier, it is happening here in this particular network. And one interesting feature is that the network is completely connected, and this means that this is for Brazil only, right? And this means that, let's say, a drug trafficking lord in the Amazons is indirectly connected to a pedophile in São Paulo, for instance. They don't know each other, but there is a relationship path that goes from one individual to the other. This is reflected in this idea of small world that you probably heard about. It basically says that, in a loose sense, that everyone in the planet is connected to everyone else through other 6 individuals, and that happens as well with criminals. It is a bit larger than typical social networks. It goes about 14 or 15, but it is still a small world, even if we're dealing with criminal networks. this is just to show you guys that this criminal network here is far away from being random. It has a heavy tail distribution. It is very regular in a mathematical sense. I'm going to move over here to just show you guys, where is it? Just 1 second here. It should be this. Can you guys see this? The web page?
Yeah, we see the
So,
web page.
Awesome. So I'm going to talk briefly about two things here. The first one that I always like to talk is about spurious correlations, and why I'm going to talk about that. As I said earlier, I'm talking about criminal physics. What is the idea of criminal physics? It's a change of perspective. Is an epistemological change. Right? It's not only using data science to analyze a social phenomenon, but to change the perspective, to change how we see science, to bring back to the original epistemologists like Francis Bacon and so forth. And this is highly relevant because we tend to use spurious correlations a lot in the police, in the academia, in government, everywhere. So this is basically the idea that there are a lot of things that correlate in nature and in society. And it doesn't mean that they are actually cause-consequence relations. Okay, so here we can see, for instance, the number of movies Margot Robbie appeared in is highly correlated to the number of firefighters in South Dakota. And I mean, correlation goes to -1 to 1, and this one is 0.874. I mean, what does it mean? Nothing. It's just spurious correlation. They behave similarly in time, but there isn't any kind of cause and consequence relation here. And the same goes with a lot of different things in society. Bachelor's degrees awarded in philosophy correlates with the electricity generation in Yemen. 0.978, almost 1, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. Right, so I'm using this to bring back to the first thing that I talked to you guys about, which is complexity. When we have complex behaviors, things that the sum of its parts is smaller than the holistic entity, we tend to have what we call emergence. A lot of different features, a lot of different behaviors tend to happen not because of someone or a group of individuals think about that or strategize that, but because of this non-linear, this complex and large amount of individuals interacting in different ways. And that brings us to a lot of noise, a lot of spurious correlation, mostly in society. So we're talking about billions perhaps of individuals interacting in non-linear ways. So a lot of things that we see in crime, we see in society, we see in economics has nothing to do to individual wills, to a group of individual will, but to the complex behavior behind it. So we have to be very careful when we are correlating things, when we are measuring, I don't know, the number of guns in whatever country with the number of homicides or whatever. We tend to go and do a cause-consequence inference about it, but it's usually not the case for one side or the other. I don't want to get political here. But this is something that is very tricky and very hard to do. So be very aware of that. And just to close, two quick things. There is a typical biological phenomenon called allometry. All of these, if you guys want, just send me an email later and I can send you the references. But the allometry is the idea that when things grow, parts of this thing tend to grow in different velocities, in different speeds. So when a baby is born, the proportions of the head to the torso to the legs is different from the proportions of the same things in an adult, an adult, right? And when we do pro rata measurements, let's say the number of homicides for each 100,000 individuals in New York City, São Paulo, in Mexico City, etc. What we are actually doing from a statistical point of view is that we are stretching a baby and comparing it to an adult. Proportions will be completely off because the proportions of a baby's body are different from the proportions of an adult. The speed of growth from the legs of the baby is different from the speed of growth from the legs of an adult human being. And that happens in society as well. As the number of individuals that inhabit a given city increases, the number of crimes, the number of sanitization or whatever, the social indexes of that city, they tend to increase in different speeds. That is called allometry. And to be completely strict about the math here, we can't and we shouldn't use pro rata to compare cities as large as Mexico City and as small as Morgantown in West Virginia. Okay, so be aware of that. And one last comment. This one's going to be real quick. I'm not sure if Veronica, if it is the case in Venezuela, but in Brazil, all special ops units use the dagger piercing a skull symbol. And that is actually because of World War II. The Nazi army had a Totenkopf, which was basically a skull symbol. And when the British special operations stormed Berlin and the other cities during the last phase of the World War II, they pierced the Totenkopf of the German army insignia. And that came at least to Brazil, the dagger piercing the skull as a symbolism of the allies, of the winning of good over evil. At least that is the symbolism of the dagger piercing the skull in Brazil. I'm not sure if it's the same all over, but at least in Brazil, that's the symbolism of that. I think I'm on time, and I'll pass the baton over to Isa, and I'm open to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Bruno. This is definitely a very, very effective class of network analysis. I'm so happy that we are recording this and posting it on our YouTube channel, because we can anytime use this for our students. Thank you so much for this brief explanation, Bruno. But this also tells us the speed in which the network science has really moved forward, studying criminology and criminal effects and activity. And also, and this is what I want to turn the conversation into, and also into interventions, into control interventions, and how can we, which is part of what Bruno was mentioning, how can we identify which kind of analysis and intervention we use for certain context, given that, as it was already explained here, each and every location and territory has its own criminal circumstances, and we cannot extrapolate conclusions or inferences from one to another. Supposing, and this is just idealism. Suppose that we have prosecutors and that we have police that are really willing to control and combat these criminal networks, and also suppose that we have these authorities empowered with this kind of intelligence tools and knowledge. So if those two assumptions were true, and we can think that this could be happening in real life, my question to you both is, how can we understand this from the perspective of the criminal strategies? So from one hand, Veronica has mentioned, this massive killings and also massive incarceration is not the answer. In this kind of strategy, if you would put that in math or in graphs or network analysis models, this would just look like an erasement of completely a network or just a group of people, which we still don't know if those were part of the organization or which roles or weights do they play inside the organizations. And also, Bruno, I was wondering, we're just describing here one first step, which is, bipartite networks, which are just person to person, the connection and the relationship from person to person. What if we add another layer of in the network, that is the connection between these individuals and the offenses that they commit? So I know in your work is also this type of approaches, learning from multi-criminal offenses and in individuals involved in these cases. So when we apply these analyses to forecast, not to only understand the past, but also wanting to understand the future and predicting risk, how can we apply these analyses for such complex networks? Maybe you have some of those cases in Brazil. So let's go ahead with this with the second round. Veronica, if you can give us your insights or any comments, most appreciated.
Yes, well, that is a very absolutely pertinent question in the current context, because what we are seeing is this massive militarized operatives that takes hundreds of young men to the prisons. For instance, in El Salvador, what we know is that the law allows to put young men into prison only because illicit associations, not because it is proven that they have already committed a crime. So what we know then is that this massive incarceration, what produces is this fostering of new networks outside the prison and inside the prison, because as young men, they know they will go into prison and they need protection, then they start to seek some kind of relationship with the criminal organizations that are based in their neighborhoods, in the sense that they can assure they will have protection in the prisons. For instance, this is a kind of a prophecy young men build. Ben Lessing's work has been important in that sense, showing how these massive incarcerations produce this strengthening of networks, and this facilitates new recruitments. So listening Bruno was very interesting, because that is the question, right? How, if we know that police investigations and the use of these tools that shows the networks and shows the different positions and roles that criminal organizations have, why they are not used extensively, right? For instance, in the harm reduction literature, the proposal is to develop criminal investigations in order to target that strategically important persons in the network in order to dismantle. Not the opposite what we are living, like putting into jail massive numbers of young men that are going to be associated, right? So that is also a question, I mean, that I'm trying to think of. Of course, we know that mano dura policies are part of electoral politics, right? But it is astounding how we know already the harm perpetrated by these massive incarcerations, and then how we are not using more targeted policies, and why we are not using these kind of tools generally in citizen security policies. I will leave it there. Yes.
Well, Bruno, any ideas on this?
Yeah, I'll start by answering some of the first provocations. So about interventions, right? This is what I call high payoff targets, topological high payoff targets. How can we do that? And in some cases, I've seen it work here in Brazil. We have to change a bit the focus. Let's take, for example, the car wash operation. It started as a drug enforcement operation in the border of Brazil and Paraguay. And it ended up reaching the current president that was arrested at the time and was involved in a lot of corruption schemes. And why is it important? Because we have the tendency to go and arrest the most prominent individual in the sense of popularity, in the sense that this guy would be, let's say, capo, a leader, right? But the idea that we gather from network science is that the individuals responsible for building up this holistic entity are not these leaders, are not these popular criminals, if you will. The high payoff targets here are actually the victims in the Granovetter sense. So in the car wash operation, for example, the high payoff targets would be the hawala operators that, for example, exchanged and laundered dirty money for drug lords and for corrupt politicals. So we have to change how we sentence criminals involved in a criminal network. The highest sentences would have to be to the weak ties, to the high payoff targets, and not to the leaders. I'm not saying that the leaders are not important. They should be addressed as well. But if we want to topologically dismantle these criminal networks, our investigations have to focus on high payoff targets. And we can, in smaller operation, or even like operations as car wash operation, we can pinpoint the weak ties We can't understand everything because we're dealing sometimes with hundreds of or thousands of criminals, but we usually can understand who are the weak ties. And if we do that and we put, let's say, the weak ties in a separate location, in a solitary, if you will, the weak ties, we can dismantle these networks. But if we do the same with leaders, that won't happen. And this is what we actually see on a daily basis in LATAM and everyone else. We see leaders being dragged into custody, into solitary confinement, etc. And it doesn't change anything from the topological perspective. We have to change focus to high payoff targets. So this is the first one. You asked about when we have connections intermediated by, let's say, a given activity. That happened in an operation that I was part of. It was called the Darknet operation here in Brazil. And we arrested 200 and almost 200 pedophiles involved in a Darknet forum. And how we actually we built the network intermediated by how they interacted in the forum. So we had pedophiles involved in a child abusive forum, and the network was built in that way. If an individual checked a post by another one, we would create an edge between this individual to the other one, the viewer to the poster. So it was an edge intermediated by the activity that they had online, right? And this can be done in different scenarios, not only online, but through different indirect exposure. It's something that is widely known in graph theory, something that can be done. And we did during the darknet operation. It was a success. We had almost 10,000 individuals in the forum, and we were able to pinpoint 180, almost 200 ones. And we built the network in that same sense that you suggested. Why we don't do that, Veronica? I think it's because it is a drastic change in perspective. I think it should be similar everywhere in LATAM, at least, that judges, magistrates, prosecutors, etc. They have a different background. They're usually have a law degree without a deep exposure to graph theory, or you don't have to go that deep, or to what's new in sociology, you know. So I think that's one of the main causes, you know, and it's hard for people to get out of their comfort zone. I mean, they are used to what they learned during college, and that's not what we are talking about here. So it's hard for someone to leave it behind, everything that they learned during their undergrad or the graduation, and just say, so everything that you learn may be wrong, and you have to shift focus. It's hard to do that for everyone, even for us. So I think this is one of the main causes. In the police, it should be similar. I think it's a bit easier because we have a more of a mixed background in the police, right? We have computer scientists, physicists, lawyers, etc. So it's a bit more mixed. So it should be a bit easier, but it's hard in the sense that you have to investigate, let's say, a federal organization involved in gangs, international trafficking, etc. And the next day you have to, let's say in the federal police here in Brazil, you have to stamp passports. You know what I mean? So we don't have institutions prepared to do that. At least in Brazil, I think it should be similar. Yeah, but I'll pass the baton over.
I guess also it's a matter of politics, right? Like mano dura policies are becoming so spectacular and so useful for politicians to win elections. We can see that on Sunday with Novoa asking if citizen security should be militarized. That is the opposite of what we are discussing here. So this kind of tools means investing a lot in police intelligence, and we don't have that tradition, at least in countries such as Venezuela, Ecuador, or I don't know, Mexico, but that would mean a definite political will to transform police forces in general in Latin America.
Yeah, and let me add also to that idea is some of the networks we're studying in Mexico and Guatemala, for instance, particularly those that are related to public procurement or public contracts. There's a lot of public officials involved in some of those activities as well. So using this kind of analysis to control or intervene a network of pedophiles that is unlinked to the government probably is effective, while using this analysis in a network that is, for instance, related to procurement contracts that were also used in elections to divert money to the elections, can lead to pinpointing politicians, public servants, and a larger number of government agencies that can be involved in this. So building capacities in anti-corruption prosecution offices or authorities or police authorities, it could be a double-edged sword too for those who have to decide to put the money on this effort as well. And
Yes,
then another,
I'm thinking, for instance, about the CeCeMeCA in Guatemala, the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala. The fact that they started to trace all the links between, I will say, the specialists of violence, and then politicians, and then how human rights abuses, corruption, criminal organization is interlinked. Then after an important success, then the new president, Jimmy Morales, dismantled the CeCeMeCA. So we have this problem of collusion between politicians and organized crime that is very complex.
Yeah, and let me pick up also the idea, Bruno, about the culture. The legal culture is we had a judge on our past seminar last month, and he was very, very sharp referring to this the law tradition. He said in the criminal law tradition, we learn in law school, to differentiate bad from good behavior. So we're always working with this dichotomy of the good people and the bad people. Whereas in these macro or criminal networks, one public official can be a very, very good father, a very good member of his community or her community, and also be involved in some of these kind of small acts that in a big scale they build up a network of corruption. So it's also a preconception from the beginning about how we conceive criminal law as well. So Bruno, you were going to say something as well.
No, yeah, I totally agree. I would say that again, not going politically about it, but the mano dura policies from the network science perspective, they could work, but, and this is a huge caveat, right, is that one would have to arrest everyone from the country, right? And exactly, that there could be some real cause consequence in this kind of policy in smaller countries. But again, going back to the allometry thing that I told you earlier, as we tend to grow in scale, it's not sustainable to do that. Even I'm not even going to the ethics of it, but it's not sustained to do that from a network science perspective. Okay. So we can argue against it not only from the ethics and the human rights perspective, but from the network science as well. Right? So if we're dealing with larger countries, as population increases, it's impossible to do that from a network science perspective. And I'd like to add, as we are talking about corruption and political corruption, right? And we published recently a paper in scientific reports, the Nature magazine, in which we showed that I'm going to share my screen here real quick.
Sure.
Cool. What? Don't worry about all the noise here. But what I want to show you is that as the recidivism rate in political corruption, cool, you're seeing it, right? So what we are seeing is as the recidivism rate in political corruption increases, there is a critical point around here. There's an inflection point here, after which we have a macro political corruption network. Why is it important? Because we have a mathematical safe number for recidivism in political corruption. And that is the key ingredient to have a macro political corruption network. So recidivism is the key factor here, and we have a number for that, right? So let's say someone was involved in 2 different corruption schemes. As the average rate of recidivism increases, let's say over 9, everything coalesces into a large political corruption network. So, and this is particular of political corruption. Drug trafficking is different. Bank robbery is different. So political corruption is particular, has this particular feature, a critical recidivism rate at which everything collapses into a higher network, criminal network. And I bring that to say that I agree with you that it is extremely hard to pass this kind of new policies, because I mean in every country some of the political involved in voting these are probably involved in some of these criminal networks, right? But again, I bring back to what I said earlier, that I would say that most of the sociological phenomena that we see are irrational, are due to how a large number of individuals with different interests interact in a complex way. So I would say that if we have a critical mass of individuals aiming at that, there will be a point that we have a phase transition, bringing back to the physics, terms, that things will start to be driven that way, even if decision makers don't want to. But it could take like 10 years or 200 years, I don't know. But at some point, it could happen.
Yeah, but this is clearly like the maths of the maths argument of a prevention strategy, right? Like you have to make a lot of efforts, not only economic efforts in the communities, to provide with jobs, to provide with education, to provide with public services, to prevent, the point of making these these networks larger or more interconnected, maybe. Okay, well, we're running out of time, but I don't know if Veronica, do you want to say something else, or Bruno? It's been a pleasure having you here. Absolutely. We are recording this session and we're going to post it in the ELAST YouTube channel, and we're definitely going to spread the word as much as we can to learn more about this conversation. And me myself, I'm going to look at it again as well. So thank you so much, Bruno. Thank you, Veronica, for this, and stay tuned for our next sessions in this seminar series. Thank you again.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.